The neighborhood looked like something out of a postcard. Manicured lawns stretched endlessly, pastel-colored houses lined the streets, and flower beds burst with color. It was quiet, peaceful even, but beneath the surface there was an unease that no amount of landscaping could hide. Fences divided properties, but they also seemed to divide people in ways that weren't always visible. In the Thompsons' backyard, laughter floated through the air. Marcus stood by the grill, flipping burgers with practiced ease. His deep chuckle mingled with Tanya's warm giggles as she teased him about overcooking the chicken again. Jasmine sat under a tree, her fingers deftly weaving Elijah's hair into intricate braids while he squirmed half-heartedly, complaining it tickled. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on their faces. For a moment, everything felt perfect. A celebration of family, community, and connection, but not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, behind drawn curtains, Mr. and Mrs. Peterson peered out at the scene. Their lips moved in hushed whispers, their expressions tight with discomfort. "Look at them," Mrs. Peterson murmured, clutching the edge of the curtain. "So many people, so loud. Don't you think it's strange?" Mr. Peterson nodded, his jaw tightening. "It doesn't feel right," he said, his voice low. "They're taking up space, making noise like this is some kind of party. What if someone gets hurt? Or worse, what if something happens and we can't call for help because of all this chaos?" Their words hung heavy in the air between them, feeding off each other's unease, until finally, Mrs. Peterson reached for the phone. Her hand trembled slightly as she dialed 911. "I'm just saying something feels off," she muttered, more to herself than to her husband. Better safe than sorry. Back in the yard, the mood shifted suddenly. The distant wail of sirens pierced the afternoon calm, growing louder with every passing second. Marcus froze mid-flip, the spatula hovering above the grill. He didn't need to turn around to know what was coming. He'd heard those sirens too many times before. Beside him, Tanya stopped laughing, her smile fading as she instinctively stepped closer to Jasmine and Elijah. She placed a protective hand on each of their shoulders, her eyes scanning the horizon. "What's going on?" Jasmine asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "Nothing, baby," Tanya replied quickly, though her tone betrayed her unease. "Just stay close, okay?" The guests exchanged nervous glances. Some whispered among themselves, their voices low but urgent. "This isn't new," one woman muttered to another, shaking her head. "We've seen this before. They'll come, ask questions, make us feel small, then leave like nothing happened." Marcus set the spatula down and turned to face the group. His expression was calm, but there was a storm brewing behind his eyes. "Everyone, stay calm," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "Whatever happens next, we handle it together. Understand?" Heads nodded, though fear lingered in the air. Jasmine clutched Elijah's hand tightly, her knuckles white. "Dad, why are the cops coming here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus crouched down to meet her gaze, his hands resting on her knees. "Because sometimes people see what they want to see instead of who we really are," he said softly. "But remember this, we belong here. This is our home, and no one gets to take that away from us." As the red and blue lights flashed against the fence, bathing the yard in an eerie glow, the Thompsons stood side by side, united despite the uncertainty looming ahead. The sound of car doors slamming echoed in the distance, followed by the crunch of boots on gravel. Marcus straightened, squaring his shoulders as he took a step forward. "Let's go meet them," he said, his voice steady. "Together." Tanya squeezed his arm briefly, offering silent support. Behind them, their friends and family formed a loose circle, standing shoulder to shoulder. For now, they were more than neighbors. They were allies, ready to face whatever came next as one. And then, the first officer appeared at the gate, his silhouette framed by the flashing lights. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. His jaw tightened as he wrestled with anger and exhaustion, emotions that had become all too familiar over the years. Another day, another reminder that no matter how hard he worked or how much respect he earned, There would always be people who saw him as less than human. He clenched his fists briefly before forcing himself to relax. "Not now," he muttered under his breath, glancing at Tanya and the kids. Protecting them meant swallowing his pride. For now. Tanya's hands trembled as she clutched a napkin, her knuckles white against the soft fabric. She tried to smile to keep up appearances for the sake of her children, but inside she was unraveling. Memories flooded back. Memories of being followed in stores, of teachers doubting her abilities, of neighbors whispering behind closed doors when she was just a girl. She couldn't let her kids grow up feeling like outsiders in their own home, yet here they were, facing the same ugliness she thought she'd left behind. Her voice cracked slightly as she leaned toward Marcus. "What do we do?" she asked quietly, her eyes searching his face for answers. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. Officers stepped into view, some exchanging uneasy glances. One older officer recognized Marcus immediately, nodding respectfully, but a younger rookie hesitated, his hand hovering near his belt. Is everything okay here?" he asked nervously, his tone uncertain. The question hung awkwardly in the air, underscoring the absurdity of the situation. Across the street, the Petersons watched from their porch, arms crossed and expressions smug. They exchanged satisfied looks, convinced they'd done the right thing. "See, I told you something wasn't right," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice tinged with self-righteousness. Mr. Peterson nodded, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Good call, hon. Someone needed to step up." Mrs. Peterson's mind drifted back to an incident at the grocery store months earlier. A black man had walked past her in the aisle, and without thinking she'd clutched her purse tighter, her heart racing. It wasn't until later that she realized what she'd done. Or why. Now, watching the chaos unfold across the street, she felt vindicated, oblivious to the harm her actions had caused. Meanwhile, Mr. Peterson remembered complaining to a friend about the changing neighborhood. "Those people are everywhere now," he'd muttered during a poker night, shaking his head. "It's not the same place it used to be." Back then, his words had been met with nods of agreement. Today, they fueled his belief that calling the police had been justified. Back in the yard, the officer's hesitation spoke volumes. Even those who knew Marcus struggled to reconcile their image of authority with the man standing before them. Systemic doubts lingered, unspoken but palpable, casting a shadow over the moment. One officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "Chief Thompson, sir," he began, trailing off as if unsure how to proceed. The guests whispered among themselves, their voices low but charged with emotion. "This is humiliating," one woman murmured, tears welling in her eyes. "We're not criminals," another guest nodded, adding bitterly, "but to them we'll always be suspects." News of the incident spread quickly, igniting divisive conversations among neighbors. Some defended the Petersons, while others sided with the Thompsons, exposing the deep-seated prejudices lurking beneath the surface. Finally, Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. "I'm Chief Marcus Thompson," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "And this is my family. My home." His words carried both authority and vulnerability, reclaiming his identity in a world that often sought to diminish. The officers apologized profusely, their words rushed and insincere. "We didn't realize, sir," one of them stammered, but the damage was done. No apology could erase the sting of being treated like criminals in their own backyard. Marcus nodded curtly, accepting their words without forgiveness. Elijah hid his face in Tanya's side, his small body trembling as tears streamed down his cheeks. "Why did they come here?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "What did we do wrong?" Tanya hugged him tightly, her own tears threatening to spill over. "Nothing, baby," she assured him. "You didn't do anything wrong." Jasmine, however, refused to stay silent. Her hands balled into fists as she stepped forward, her voice rising above the murmurs. "This isn't fair," she exclaimed, her words sharp with outrage. "We weren't doing anything wrong. Why should we have to explain ourselves to anyone? Her anger sparked a fire within her, fueling a determination not to let this experience silence her. If they won't listen, she vowed, then we'll make them hear us. As the evening wore on, whispers spread throughout the neighborhood. Some residents defended the Petersons, dismissing the incident as a simple misunderstanding. Others condemned their actions, sharing stories of their own experiences with racism. Divisions deepened, laying bare the prejudices that had long simmered beneath the surface. Yet amidst the tension, seeds of change began to take root, planting hope for a future where understanding might replace fear. Marcus gestured toward the house, his voice calm but firm. "Come inside," he said to the officers, motioning them toward the kitchen table. "Let's talk." The invitation caught them off guard. This wasn't how these situations usually unfolded, but they followed him in, their boots scuffing softly against the tiled floor. Marcus poured coffee into mugs, his movements deliberate. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he let the silence settle, heavy and charged. When he finally broke it, his tone was measured, almost gentle. "I've been where you are," Marcus began, leaning forward slightly. "Standing on someone's doorstep, unsure if I'm walking into a situation or just another misunderstanding. But what happens next matters. How we treat people, that's what builds trust, or breaks it." His words hung in the air, resonating with both conviction and vulnerability. One officer shifted uncomfortably while another nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what he was saying. Outside, Tanya gathered the guests in a loose circle beneath the shade of a large oak tree. She sat cross-legged on the grass, her hands resting on her knees as she looked around at the faces staring back at her. Some were angry, others hurt, but all carried the same quiet determination to be heard. "We've all been here before," Tanya said softly, her voice steady despite the tremor threatening to break through. "In one way or another, let's share our stories, not for pity, but so we can understand each other better." At first, no one spoke. The silence stretched taut, until an older man cleared his throat. "I was pulled over once," he said, his voice low but steady, "for no reason, just driving home from work. The officer told me I fit the description." "What description?" I asked him. He didn't answer. Heads nodded around the circle, murmurs of recognition rippling through the group. A young woman chimed in next, her voice trembling with emotion. "I was shopping with my mom when I was 12. A store clerk followed us everywhere, even after we paid. My mom tried to laugh it off, but I saw the way her hands shook when she signed the receipt. That's not something you forget." Each story added layers to the collective pain, painting a vivid picture of systemic injustice that none of them could ignore. Later that evening, Marcus stood in the living room, his phone pressed to his ear as he made calls to neighbors. "We need to have this conversation," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, before things get worse." By the time he hung up, he'd organized a neighborhood meeting for the following evening. It wasn't just about addressing what had happened, it was about accountability, understanding, and change. The meeting hall buzzed with tension as residents filed in, their expressions ranging from defensive to curious. The Petersons sat near the front, their arms crossed tightly across their chests. Others clustered in small groups, whispering heatedly. When Marcus stepped onto the makeshift stage, a simple podium borrowed from the community center, the room fell silent. "This isn't easy," Marcus began, his voice carrying a mix of authority and compassion, "but it's necessary. We're here because something went wrong, not just yesterday, but long before that. Prejudice doesn't start with a phone call to 911. It starts with assumptions, with fear, with privilege we don't even realize we have." He paused, letting his words sink in. "And it ends when we choose to listen, really listen." His speech struck a nerve. Some neighbors nodded along, visibly moved, while others bristled, muttering under their breath. The Petersons exchanged uneasy glances, their defenses beginning to crack. Mrs. Peterson fidgeted with her purse strap, her mind flashing back to the grocery store incident months earlier. For the first time, she wondered if her actions had ever made someone feel small or unsafe. Her thoughts were interrupted by a young girl standing near the podium, her voice shaking but resolute. "I was 8 when a security guard followed me in a store," the girl recounted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I wasn't stealing anything. I was picking out a birthday card for my mom, but he kept watching me like I was going to take something, like I didn't belong there." Mrs. Peterson felt the air leave her lungs as though she'd been punched. Her eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed by guilt and shame. Mr. Peterson reached out hesitantly, placing a hand on her shoulder, but he, too, seemed shaken. Around the room, other neighbors began to shift in their seats, listening more intently than before. One woman wiped away tears as she listened to a father describe being mistaken for a janitor at his own office building. Another man nodded solemnly, recalling the sting of being turned away from a rental property despite having perfect credit. Slowly, walls of defensiveness crumbled, replaced by flickers of empathy and understanding. As the meeting drew to a close, Marcus offered a final thought. "Change won't happen overnight," he admitted, his voice tinged with both realism and hope. "But every conversation like this brings us closer. Every moment of listening plants a seed, and maybe, just maybe, those seeds will grow into something stronger than the divisions that brought us here today." The crowd dispersed slowly, some lingering to shake hands or exchange numbers. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before now found themselves sharing smiles, or promises to meet again. Though the road ahead remained uncertain, the evening ended on a hopeful note, with small but meaningful connections forming in its wake. The Petersons stood awkwardly at the edge of the Thompsons' driveway, clutching a handwritten note. Mrs. Peterson cleared her throat nervously before speaking, her voice trembling slightly. We wanted to say we're sorry," she began, glancing down at the paper as if it might offer her courage. "What happened wasn't right. We acted out of fear and ignorance, and we hurt people we should have trusted." Mr. Peterson nodded stiffly beside her, his jaw tight but his eyes betraying a flicker of remorse. The neighbors gathered around exchanged uneasy glances. Some crossed their arms, skeptical of the sincerity behind the apology. One woman muttered under her breath, "It's easy to say sorry when everyone's watching." But others stepped forward, offering quiet words of encouragement. "It takes guts to admit you were wrong," an older man said gruffly, though his tone softened as he added, "I hope you mean it." Marcus watched from a distance, his expression thoughtful. Later that evening, he sat on the porch steps, staring out at the quiet street. Tanya joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Do you think they really get it?" she asked softly. Marcus sighed, leaning back against the railing. "Maybe not fully," he admitted, "but this is how change starts. One hard conversation, one apology, one small step at a time. It's messy and it's slow, but it's progress." Inside the house, the Thompson family gathered around the dinner table. The mood was subdued but resolute. "We can't let this define us," Marcus said firmly, looking each of them in the eye. "They tried to make us feel like outsiders, but this is our home, and we're going to keep living our lives. Loudly, proudly, without fear." Jasmine nodded, her chin lifted defiantly. "Yeah. If anything, this just makes me want to show them who we really are." Over the following weeks, subtle shifts began to take shape in the neighborhood. A few neighbors started showing up uninvited to the Thompsons' next gathering, bringing dishes to share or simply sitting quietly on the sidelines. At first, the interactions felt strained, but slowly, conversations blossomed. One neighbor complimented Tanya on her potato salad. Another asked Marcus about his work as police chief. Small gestures, perhaps, but enough to chip away at the invisible walls that had divided them for so long. Jasmine found herself drawn to the garage door, paintbrush in hand. She worked tirelessly, pouring her frustration, pain, and hope into every stroke. When Elijah wandered over to watch, she explained her vision. His hands. "They're all different colors, shapes, sizes," she said, pointing to the outlines she'd sketched. But they're reaching out to each other. That's what matters. Connection. Her brother smiled faintly, nodding. It's cool, Jazz, like you're saying something without even talking. By the time the mural was finished, word had spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors trickled over, some curious, others moved by what they saw. Mrs. Peterson lingered near the back, tears welling in her eyes as she traced the image of two hands clasped together with her gaze. This is beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Nearby, Marcus noticed her reaction and approached cautiously. "It's a reminder," he said gently, "that no matter where we come from, we're stronger when we stand together." For a moment, the street fell silent as everyone paused to take in the mural. Even those who had once been quick to judge now seemed to see the Thompsons, and themselves, in a new light. There was still work to be done, wounds to heal, and bridges to build. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by art and possibility, the neighborhood took its first tentative steps toward unity.